I want to welcome everybody here today. This is a very exciting event. It's an event that I look forward to every year. It's the 11th annual American Values Survey. And my colleague Bill Galston and I have been so honored for the last 11 years to work with our friend Robbie Jones, who is the CEO and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute on this project, and to invite extraordinary commentators to join us for this discussion. And I'll introduce our extraordinary commentators in a moment. I just want to let everyone listening know that there are two ways you can get your questions to us. One is by email at events@brookings.edu. The other is by way of Twitter at hashtag AVS2020. And obviously, any wonderful remarks you want to make, comments on the comments of our brilliant analysts, Carlin and Andra, or anything else you want to say can be put on there. But if your questions go up there, we will see them and we will get back to you. The way we're going to do this today is that Robbie is going to do one of his patented PowerPoints. I try to think of a metaphor every year for what Robbie is to PowerPoints. After this year's NBA bubble, I think I just have to say he's the LeBron James of PowerPoints. And I think you're going to learn a great deal from that. And then I will bring in, and my friend Bill Galston will come in, my colleague, and he'll bring in Carlin and Andra. Before we go on, I really do want to thank at the Brookings Institution, Darrell West, the Vice President for Governance Studies, who has been a supporter of this project right from the outset. My assistant, Megan Bell, who has done extraordinary work to bring this about. Letty Davalos, the same. I also want to thank Emily Perkins, who has kept this show on the road for us, kept gas in the tank, you might say, for a very long time. Thanks to all of them. So let me introduce this fantastic panel. Robbie Jones is the CEO and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute, aka PRRI, and a leading scholar and commentator on religion, culture, and politics. He is the author of an extraordinary, I want to tell you something fascinating here. That as I was speaking, all my notes were gobbled up by what I said because I had record on my phone. So now I will catch up. He is the author of the very widely well-reviewed book, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. This book has gotten so much deserved attention over the last couple of months. And it's really an important book for all of us to think about. He is also the author of The End of White Christian America. He writes regularly on politics, culture, and religion for The Atlantic, NBC Think, and many other outlets. And he's been featured all over the place at pretty much every cable network, NPR, the New York Times, the Washington Post. And he serves as on the National Program Committee for the American Academy of Religion. Carlin Bowman is a very dear friend, one of my very first editors in life, and one of the very best, very, very best, a long time ago. She is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. She compiles, analyzes polling data on a variety of subjects, including the economy, the taxes, the state of workers in America, the environment and climate change, attitudes on same-sex marriage, trade, and a whole series of other areas. She has spoken a lot over the years about the evolution of American politics and demographic change. She writes a weekly column for Forbes.com. And we are blessed that Carlin has joined us on these events for many, many years. And we're really grateful, Carlin, to have you back. And Andra Gillespie, welcome, Andra, is Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference at Emory University, where I should note Robbie also attended and got your PhD. got his PhD. Before joining the faculty as an analyst, before joining the faculty, she was an analyst with the firm of Democratic pollster Mark Mellman. She teaches undergraduate and graduate courses at Emory in American and African American politics, African American political leadership, political participation, qualitative methods, and race and elections. It's an awesome group. And Robbie, take it away. I can't wait to see what you have created for us for Zoom this year. There we go.
All right. Thank you, EJ, for that very generous I feel like introduction. I feel like you set the bar higher every year for the PowerPoint, but we'll see if we can not disappoint this year. I wanted to just say a few things. First of all, to the amazing PRRI team. A big study like this is always a team effort. So I want to thank our research team, Natalie Jackson, Ian Huff, and Deanna Arcez. Sean Sands, our chief of staff, make sure all the balls stay in the air, and Doug Barkley and Tim Duffy, who is no good having data if it doesn't look good or communicate well. So thanks to them for making sure the layout is right, the charts look the way they do, and a big thanks there, and to the Kivik Communications team as well, to get it all out there into the hands of the public and reporters. So with that, I will jump in here to what do we found, this year. I want to say one more thing. I do want to say certainly to EJ and Bill, thank you for more than a decade. It's rare that you get to do anything for a decade. So it's great that we've been able to do this. And this year marks decade number 2 as the 11th year. So thanks for that. And here's to more great and interesting work in the future. So with that, we will dive in. So just a little bit about what you'll be seeing. This is the 11th Annual American Values Survey conducted in partnership with Brookings Institution by PRRI. This year, it's a survey of over 2,500 adults based on a sample from the AmeriSpeak, which is a probability panel run by the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago. There also, we did a follow-up survey, the supplemental survey of just over 1,000 adults in October to pick up any late changes in the landscape. And of course, it would be remiss without saying a warm word of thanks to the groups who made this possible. The Carnegie Corporation of New York, with additional support from the Ford Foundation, the Wilbur and Hilda Glenn Family Foundation, and the Unitarian Universalist Beach Program at Shelter Rock. Thanks so much for your generous support. All right, so we're going to jump in. First of all, last year in AVS, we noted that when we asked Americans to rank their most critical issues, that the two political parties, Democrats and Republicans, shared absolutely nothing in common in their top 3 issues. This year, we see very, very similar big divides. There is one place of agreement this year, and that is in the fairness of presidential elections. So the numbers in front of you right now are all Americans. You can see the coronavirus pandemic right at the top, but right behind that, fairness of presidential elections and healthcare and jobs and unemployment squeaking by into majority territory. A number of other things falling a little below that, mostly because of the partisan differences on those. But let me show you. So this is all Americans. Here are Democrats and where Democrats are on these issues. As you can see, many more issues Democrats rank as critical compared to the public. So in strong majority territory, not just on the pandemic and fairness of elections, but on healthcare, also foreign interference in presidential elections, and racial inequality also at nearly 7 and 10 on the priority list. Jobs and unemployment up a little bit for the general public at 58%. But note the contrast between Democrats and Republicans, self-identified Republicans on this issue. Much lower across the board. In fact, there's only 3 issues among Republicans that veer into majority territory, sharing again with Democrats the fairness of presidential elections, but also crime and terrorism. Those are 2 issues that are below majority saying they're critical, among all Americans and Democrats, but they are in fact the top two issues, along with fairness of presidential elections among Republicans. And then I want to draw attention to the bottom here, this issue of racial inequality. We're going to come back to this and a couple of other findings here. But we are looking at a 50-point spread here between Republicans and Democrats on saying racial inequality as a critical issue. And nearly 7 in 10 Democrats, only about 1 in 5 Republicans saying the same thing. So we'll see this pattern more. But again, similar to last year, the only thing that two parties really agree are critical issues are the fairness of presidential elections. Both parties concerned about that. So I'm going to look at the coronavirus and also the protests through partisan lenses here at the top of the presentation. We'll start with the coronavirus pandemic, which, as you saw, I should back up. I just want to make sure I point this out also, that Republicans are actually only 39% of Republicans say the coronavirus pandemic is a critical issue to them. And that's another one, again, a more than 40-point spread between the two political parties. And very notable how low this is among Republicans. So having said that, to set the table, let's take a look at just the really different realities in the pandemic, whether we're talking about the origins of the virus. We had a question asked whether Americans believe the virus developed naturally or whether it was developed in a lab. The country is basically divided on that question, but not so divided on whether the spread of the virus could have been controlled better. 7 in 10 say that it could have been controlled better, and about 2/3, a little less than 2/3, disapprove of Trump's handling of the pandemic. But again, the partisan divides on these are quite large. On the origins of the virus, here again, you see a 50-point spread essentially. On whether the spread could have been controlled better, another 50-point spread between Republicans and Democrats. And here also, we're going to have a category, this category at top, Fox News Republican. These are Republicans who say they most trust Fox News to give them accurate information on current events and politics. This makes up about 40% of the Republican Party. So 4 in 10 Republicans are in that group. And I'm breaking them out here because on a number of questions, they look significantly different from other Republicans. So you can see here, for example, the daylight between Republicans and those who most trust Fox News here. Essentially, half as many Fox News Republicans believe the spread could have been controlled better compared even to Republicans overall. And you'll notice here also that Republicans who most trust Fox News heavily behind the president, only 5% disapprove of his handling of the pandemic compared to 4 times that many among Republicans overall at 22%. And nearly all Democrats here, more than 9 in 10, disapproving of Trump's handling of the pandemic. So that's a 70-point spread on the president's handling of the pandemic. Also we'll have a couple of slides that have a few swing groups here. And taking a look at groups that are sort of in the middle, most of these groups supported Trump in the past election, but are kind of groups that have been that are basically in the middle and are considered swing groups. So I'm going to do these first 2 items from the last slide. Disapprove of Trump's handling of the pandemic, or believe the spread could have been controlled better. Among all Americans, these are the same numbers from the previous slide: 65, 69 on disapproval, and believe the spread could have been controlled better. And if we look at women, or white women, you'll see, and this is a group that particularly white women with a 4-year college degree, a group that President Trump has been struggling with in the polls, but actually won barely in 2016, 69%. So it's basically 7 to 10 both disapprove of his handling of the pandemic and believe the spread could have been controlled better. And even among white women with no 4-year degree, so white working class women are both in majority territory on that question. Among seniors, very similarly, another group that Trump won in 2016, it's 61% disapprove his handling of the pandemic, and a little more than 2/3 believe the spread could have been controlled better. In the religious landscape, there are basically 2 groups that are kind of swing groups. They're white Catholics and white mainline Protestants. Again, Trump won each of these groups by about 6 and 10 in the case of white mainline Protestants, and a little more than that actually among white Catholics. But here again, white Catholics is a group I'm going to draw some attention to as we go. 60% disapprove his handling of the pandemic. 65% believe it could have been controlled better. And then we were able to break out a few states altogether, and we're calling these key Rust Belt states. These are, again, kind of states that are more divided, like swing states. In the Rust Belt category, we have Iowa, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. In the Sun Belt category, we have Arizona, Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina. And you'll see here, among these states too, we still have about 2/3 or more both disapproving of the pandemic. So, and the spread could have been controlled better. So kind of across the board in these swing groups, we don't see a lot of good news for President Trump. Even groups that supported him in 2016 are very unhappy about how the pandemic has been handled. On the subject too, we asked about who trusts which sources to give them accurate information about the pandemic. And these are the people who said they had a lot of trust, or the percent of Americans who said they had a lot of trust in the following sources. So you can see this is all Americans across the top here. University researchers, Dr. Anthony Fauci, Centers for Disease Control, kind of topping out the list, but really only about half or a little bit more than Americans saying they have a lot of trust in those sources. But you will notice that Donald Trump is down at the end of the list at 14%, only 14% of the country. It's essentially half as many who say Biden, but Biden is still below 3 in 10, saying they have a lot of trust in him. These are Democrats, so more likely to trust most sources across the board than the American public. It drops down a little bit on state and local government, but it drops down to 1 on President Trump. These are Republicans. As you can see, support drops below, in most cases, where the public is. And even among, it's notable, I think, even among Republicans, only 39%, so they have a lot of trust in President Trump. It's about the same as for the CDC and university research centers, but nothing reaching anywhere near majority among Republicans. And this darker red is a group of Fox News Republicans, those who most trust Fox News. Again, they are nowhere near anywhere majority except for President Donald Trump, 58% saying President Trump. And note the zero among Joe Biden. It is absolutely 0% saying that they have a lot of trust in Joe Biden. So you can really see the effect of Fox News among Republicans on these numbers. So let's kind of turn to the election and take a look at the electoral process and the candidates. The other thing that we found is that, and by the way, these are negative. See, this is the people who are not at all confident. So not at all confident the election will be conducted fairly. That's 1/3 of Americans who say they are not at all confident. About 4 in 10 Americans say they are not at all confident that voting by mail will be as secure as voting in person. And a majority, 55%, are not at all confident that Trump will concede defeat if he loses the election. And again, you can see, you'll be able to see the big divides between Democrats and Republicans here. Again, some kind of partisan, consistent with the kind of worries about the fairness of the election. In the previous question, you see about the same number being not at all confident the election will be conducted fairly. But Republicans are much less likely to trust voting by mail, perhaps taking cues from the president on this. A majority of them said they're not as all confident that voting by mail will be as secure as voting in person. And on the last one, we have 3/4, a little bit more actually, of 3/4 of Democrats saying they are not at all confident that Trump will concede defeat if he loses the election. And on the last one, I'm not quite sure whether to say only or even 24% of Republicans say that they are not at all confident Trump will concede defeat if he loses the election. The other thing we're seeing, consistent with a lot of other polling and even the early voting and absentee voting numbers that are out there, very high enthusiasm for this election. And in fact, we see a kind of record number of people telling us they are absolutely certain that they are going to vote. And actually in our follow-up survey, we had 15% saying they had already voted in the election. And one thing also that's notable here is that in 2016, there was an advantage. Republicans had about a 7-point advantage of partisans saying they were absolutely certain to vote. This year, that enthusiasm gap is closed. So it's basically 85%, but again, a record high of both Democrats and Republicans saying they're absolutely certain they're going to vote this year. The other thing we asked about was about motivation? Were you voting, for those who said they were supporting one candidate or the other, we asked, well, is this more a vote for the candidate, or is it more a vote against their opponent? And so we're able to compare 2016 and 2020, and even the difference between September and October of 2020. I'm going to put up 2016 and 2020, both in September, to compare. And first look at Trump's support. It's changed quite dramatically, actually. So in 2016, we had about 40% of Trump supporters saying they were voting for him, but we had about 6 in 10 saying they were voting against the Democrat, that is Hillary Clinton. This time around, the numbers have basically reversed themselves, and we have 2/3 saying they're voting for Trump, only about 1/3 saying they're voting against Biden. On the Democratic side, the patterns look a bit similar. That last time around in 2016, 54% of those supporting Hillary Clinton said they were voting against Trump versus 46% who said they were voting for her. This time, Biden is a little bit more in September, actually, people saying they were voting against Trump than voting for Biden, but that moves in over the last month. In fact, so Trump's numbers still look about the same, many more people saying they're voting for him than against Biden. But now Biden's numbers have actually evened out just about as many saying they're voting for him as voting against Trump. So a little bit of a shift in the dynamics just over the last month there. So in this survey, we did a supplemental survey following up in October. And we developed 2 different likely voter models, one that predicts a kind of average turnout that looks more like 2016, and one that predicts a higher turnout around 70%, which is very high, which would be high compared to 2016, but consistent with the way that voters are telling us that they're going to vote this time. And I'll go ahead and just put up both of these here. If we're looking at average turnout, our supplemental survey predicts that or have people telling us 54% telling us they'll vote for Joe Biden versus 40% for Trump. So it's a 14-point spread. But if it's high turnout, Biden's lead opens up to 18 points, 56 to 38. But we do still have 7% out saying either they're voting for some other candidate or they don't know or refused out there. So kind of paying attention to that on the outside. So what does the religious landscape look like in terms of their reporting and who they're going to vote for? Here, this is using numbers consistent with the high turnout model at 70%. Here, the first one I'll put up here is white evangelical Protestants. We're showing absolutely no movement of this group. If there's one number you know about the religious landscape from 2016, it's probably that 81% of white evangelicals, according to the exit polls, voted for Trump. But notably, when we went back and looked at our 2016 survey that was taken just ahead of the election, about this time in the race in 2016, this number is actually up 10 points. So we actually had white evangelicals at 69%, even though they eventually voted 81% for Trump. So we had them up from where they were this time in the election cycle last go round. And then I'm going to put up here the groups that are heavily leaning toward Joe Biden. These are Hispanic Catholics. Those are non-Christian religions, so Jews, Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, etc. Those who are religiously unaffiliated. And down here anchoring the bottom are African-American Protestants. And I want to just kind of note this bookend here of white evangelical Protestants and African-American Protestants in the country. It's remarkable in many ways because of how much theologically these two groups share. And yet the main thing, as those theological beliefs get refracted through the lens of race, they head in almost entirely diametrically opposed political direction. So it's really just worth noting this great distance here between, and we're talking, like 75-point difference between white evangelical Protestants on the one hand and African-American Protestants on the other. And the two groups I haven't put up here yet are groups that are really more kind of in the middle here. These are two groups that did vote for President Trump in 2016, but here's where they are today. White mainline Protestants basically evenly divided on this point. It's worth saying there that is actually quite different from when we had them last time. On white mainline Protestants, the Trump side hasn't moved that much, but Biden is up relative to Hillary Clinton by 11 points. There, we only had 37% at this point in time in the race last year saying they were going to vote for Hillary Clinton versus 48% this time around. And then among white Catholics, we have a more sizable lead, 54-41. Among white Catholics. Again, that's a group that supported President Trump in the last election. And this is also up 10 points compared to where we had them at this point in the race last time around. Again, Trump's side of the equation hasn't moved that much, but last time around we had 44% of white Catholics reporting they were going to vote for Hillary Clinton. This time we have 54% reporting that they're going to vote for Joe Biden. So racial inequalities, we talked about the pandemic. Look at the racial inequality through partisan lenses. Big divides on this question as well. Two similar questions on racial justice here. One, we have nearly 2/3 of the country disapproving of Trump's handling of the protest for racial justice, and 57% who say they believe that Trump has encouraged white supremacists with his decisions and behavior in the country. As you might imagine, there are very large divides among partisans here. We have nearly all Democrats, 9 in 10, disapproving of his handling of the protests against racial justice, and nearly as many saying that they believe Trump has encouraged white supremacist groups. Among Republicans, and particularly Fox News Republicans, you can see this dramatic difference. Again, 70 points basically between the two parties, and 80 points between Fox News, those who Republicans who most trust Fox News. So really different partisan lenses on this. This is a very similar slide to the pandemic, where you have these key swing groups across the bottom here. The news is also not great, I think, for President Trump on disapproval and those who believe he's encouraged white supremacist groups among many of these key groups. The one, again, I think draw attention to are white women with a 4-year college degree, basically 7 in 10 disapproving of his handling of the protests and believing that he's encouraged white supremacist groups. That number drops off a bit for women, particularly on believing the president's encouraged white supremacist groups for white women without a college degree. Among seniors, about 6 in 10 on both of these sentiments. And among white Catholics and white mainline Protestants, you'll see here a little more divided, particularly on whether the president's encouraged white supremacist groups. But among white Catholics, 56% saying that they disapprove of how he's handled the protests. And again, if we look at these key states, kind of the Rust Belt states and the Sun Belt states, we're looking at more than 6 in 10 disapproving of his handling of the protest, and at least slim majorities saying that he's encouraged white supremacist groups. The survey, one of the more interesting questions we had in the survey was an embedded experiment. And we basically split the sample into two demographically identical subsamples. And we asked one half of the sample one version of a question, and we asked the other half of the sample another version of the question. So these were kind of quarantine samples. They only got one version of the question or the other, but then we could compare the responses between these two different questions demographically to see where people dropped off depending on what was in the question. So the question was, it always makes our country better when the first version of the question said, Americans speak up and protest unfair treatment by the government. Here we have about 6 in 10 Americans agreeing that it always makes our country better when Americans speak up and protest unfair treatment by the government. However, when we changed the word Americans and we inserted just one word, the word Black, in front of Americans, we see a distinctively different pattern. The number drops from 61 to 52% of Americans agreeing that it always makes our country better when Black Americans speak up and protest unfair treatment by the government. And what you can really see the difference when you look particularly among white subgroups and among partisans here. You can see, so I'm going to go through just a few of these here. So here are all Americans. Again, here are these subgroups actually saying they agree it always makes our country better when Americans speak up and protest unfair treatment by the government. It ranges from 71% of Democrats to 49% of Republicans, and just a little bit less than that of Fox News Republicans, basically being divided on that question. White evangelicals in majority territory, whites in majority territory. But note what happens again when they get the version of the question that says it makes our country better when Black Americans speak up and protest. Significant drop off nearly across the board. I'll start with all white Americans. This is a 14-point drop among white Americans when the protesters are specified to be Black Americans. And you'll see these numbers just get bigger down the way. It's 20-point drop off among white evangelical Protestants. It's a 25-point drop-off among Republicans, and it is a yawning 37-point drop-off among Republicans who most trust Fox News. Even among whites with a four-year college degree, notably, who tend to be kind of more progressive on racial issues, there's a 12-point drop-off there. But notably among Democrats overall, there is no drop-off at all. So the partisan differences here, 25 drop-off among Republicans when the protesters are specified to be Black versus no drop-off, gives you a real sense of kind of how a racial lens has really been brought to these kind of perceptions of the protests and whether or not they are a good thing or a bad thing for the country. And finally, in the last section here, I want to do a little bit of walking through some cracks in what I'm calling Trump's white Christian wall of support. So again, Trump won all white Christian subgroups in the 2016 election. And we've been tracking favorability over the past year, actually the past couple of years, very consistently. And here's what it looks like. This first number is in this December 2019 is actually the average of all of our surveying across 2019. About 2/3 held a favorable view. You can see that's ebbed and flowed, particularly through the summer of the pandemic. But as the election season has kicked in, it has jumped back up to basically what had been historic levels. Since his election, it's basically been somewhere between 2/3 and 80% of support among white evangelical Protestants. So we're seeing that's fairly consistent. A lot more volatility among white mainline Protestants, who are down now at 50, basically divided on whether they have a favorable view of the president or not. And considerable volatility among white Catholics. And in fact, in June, July, in June, July, and going into August, we had only less than 40% of white Catholics holding a favorable view of the president. That rebounded a bit again as the election season kind of kicked off, and has dropped a bit now. But you'll notice that, like back in 2019, there was a divide really between white evangelicals on the one hand and others, but it was 14 points, essentially 14, 15 points. That number today is more like 25 points. So it was at 15 points in 2019, is 25 points, the gap between white evangelicals and other white Christian subgroups. That's notable in particular because especially in those upper Midwest states, the kind of Rust Belt swing states, white mainline Protestants and white Catholics, for example, are as big or bigger a proportion of the population in states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Here I want to take a look at Christian divides, on these white Christian divides on the candidates and religion. So the two questions here, one is people who say that either Trump or Biden has strong religious beliefs, and on the right, the one who say the person Trump or Biden models religious values with their behavior and speech. And so what we see here is all Americans are much more likely to say Biden rather than Trump, about twice as likely, has strong religious beliefs. But white evangelicals are the inverse, twice as likely to say that President Trump has strong religious beliefs versus Vice President Biden. However, white Catholics and white mainline, again, this kind of crack in this wall of support, are the other way around. On the question about modeling religious values, again, all Americans significantly more likely to say this applies to Biden rather than Trump. White evangelicals strongly disagree, again, more than twice as likely to say that this applies to Trump rather than Biden. However, the same pattern among white Catholics and white mainline Protestants, more likely to say this applies to Biden rather than Trump. So again, a kind of different orientation there. And kind of just go back to the virus and show you where these groups are on disapproving of Trump's handling of the virus, thinking the spread of the virus could have been controlled better. White evangelicals disagree with those things, are less likely to disapprove, less likely to say they've been controlled better. But look at white mainline Protestants and particularly white Catholics here. 6 in 10 disapprove, 65% think the coronavirus could have been controlled better than it was. One other note here where we see some distance between white evangelicals on the one hand and white mainline Protestants and Catholics on the other. It's not dramatic, but I think it's significant and notable. One thing that we have seen is that the protests over the last few years and this summer have actually shifted the country's view on the issue of whether, for example, the killing of African-American men by police are isolated incidents, or the other half of the question is, or whether they are part of a pattern of how police treat African-Americans. And you'll see that we've seen a 10-point drop since 2015. We first asked this question on the number of Americans who say they are isolated incidents. So from 53 down to 43% today. But white evangelical Protestants haven't moved at all on this question. 7 in 10 5 years ago, 7 in 10 today see these as isolated incidents. But you'll see some movement here among white mainline Protestants and white Catholics. They have both dropped. And back in 5 years ago, there was no daylight at all between white evangelicals and other white Christians in the country. Today, it's double-digit differences: 70% among white evangelicals, 58 and 57 among white mainline Protestants and white Catholics. So again, just some daylight opening up there on this issue of racial justice in the country. I put this slide in really because of all the conversations around the Supreme Court, the Barrett nomination, and the issues of same-sex marriage and abortion coming up here. It's notable that all Americans, 6 in 10, favor the legality of abortion. And in our recent survey, this number actually keeps creeping up. 7 in 10 Americans today favor allowing gay and lesbian couples to legally marry. Even a majority of seniors today, those over the age of 65, favor marriage equality today. White evangelicals looking very different than the rest of the country. You can see here only 22% saying abortion should be legal, and only 34% saying gay and lesbian couples should be able to legally marry. But again, just kind of noting the kind of cultural differences between these two groups here, very, very different profiles on these two issues of abortion and same-sex marriage. White Catholics, for example, 2/3 saying that gay and lesbian couples should be able to marry, 53% favoring the legality of abortion. And finally, here, before I wrap up, one final slide. Again, you can see some differences on two questions that are really about threats to American values or to American culture here. These are two questions that were agree, disagree questions. And what I'm going to show you here is the percent of Americans who disagree with these two statements. One, immigrants are invading our country and replacing our cultural and ethnic background. Or two, the values of Islam are at odds with American values and way of life. This is a percent who disagrees. Notably, this is the first time since PRI has been asking this question since 2012 that we have found a majority of Americans disagreeing that the values of Islam are at odds with American values and way of life. Here are white evangelicals, the percent, again, who disagree with each of those statements, but again, a notably different profile from other white Christian subgroups, white mainline Protestants and white Catholics in particular in the country. 2/3 disagree with that statement about immigrants, and 55%, solid majority, disagree with the statement about Islam. Now, at least I land this plane amid just a bunch of debris and partisan divide. I do want to kind of have one last slide where there are a few places of bipartisan agreement here. And we asked a question about whether the things, especially in the wake of the pandemic and the economic crises in the country, whether we needed major policy changes to help everyday Americans, given how bad things have gotten in the country. And the sentiment is pretty dark out there about people. Most Americans think things are going in the wrong direction. For example, 79% of Americans, including 93% of Democrats and 62% of Republicans, all agree that we need some major policy changes to help everyday Americans. I put two up here two policies that we tested on this front: guaranteeing all Americans a minimum income and guaranteeing all Americans access to affordable childcare. Here on the childcare question, we've got supermajorities of both parties, 83% of the country agreeing or favoring that policy, and guaranteeing Americans a minimum income. Again, 7 in 10 Americans favoring that, 88% of Democrats, and actually a slim majority, 52% of Republicans. So with that little up note, I'm going to wrap it, and we will hand it back over to EJ and Bill and on to the discussion.
Well, thank you, Robbie, for that brisk canter through a massive report. I'm amazed that you didn't pause for breath. We have about 50 minutes left, and let me tell everybody how we're going to spend those 50 minutes. First, turn to Professor Andrea Gillespie of Emory University and Carlin Bowman of the American Enterprise Institute for their reactions, each for about 5 minutes. We'll then divide the remaining time about equally between a panel discussion and audience questions. So without further ado, Andrew Gillespie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bill. And thank you, EJ, and the rest of Brookings for inviting me to this. I'm really honored to be a part of this panel. And thank you, Robbie, for suggesting for this. It's been really fun to look at your data, and I can't wait to actually play with this a little bit more. The data that Robbie presents is fascinating and valuable. But what struck me most is the consistency of the data. This consistency puts the current climate and the current election cycle into context and suggests challenges that await us in a post-election America. And I'm using post-election America very literally. I'm not trying to sort of put my thumb on what I think the outcome of the election will be. So let me start with the things that don't change that I do think actually are most relevant for what we're going to see happen in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So most important, PRRI's data shows a consistency in Trump's base of support that appears to inure him to please to modify his behavior. His approval rating is constant. His supporters remain loyal. His most friendly media outlet consumption correlates with a near unanimous discipline amongst those who are viewing it. This undergirds Trump's strategy of doubling down on his 2016 election strategy. Now, to be sure, there are problems with this strategy. It's 2020, it's not 2016, and Donald Trump is no longer the ingenue candidate. Voters aren't taking a leap of faith on him based on what he's promising. They know based on what he's done, what to expect in the next 4 years. And this is problematic for Trump. Election forecasters have been struggling with this. And many election forecasters who typically use GDP growth, for instance, as an independent variable in their models have actually switched to COVID job approval because they think that that's a stronger predictor this year. And it was hard to deal with the 30% drop in GDP because that was just going to throw everything off. So this doesn't portend well for Trump. And time is actually running out to change the narrative on the optics of how President Trump is responding to the crisis. But still, we'll wait and see if anything changes with those numbers in the next 2 weeks that's actually going to shift the outcome of the election. There are other things, though, that haven't changed a lot or have had that have greater impact on post-2020 policy debates and institutional arguments. And they're sort of tied into sort of the remaining of my election 2020 arguments. And so here, the data on race jump out, in part because of institutional concerns later, but also in part because of what I think this could portend for the 2020 election results. So from a vote choice standpoint, PRRI's numbers on Hispanic attitudes are actually really interesting to me. The 2016 exit polls were somewhat surprising in that they showed an increase in Republican support amongst Latinx voters compared to 2012. Now, there are questions about sampling, particularly in exit polls with Latino populations. But what I'm going to be really curious to see happening in the next couple of weeks is what Hispanic voting looks like and what the breakdown is between Republican and Democratic voting. PRRI points to the need to look at religious differences amongst the Latinx population that actually speak to me to 2004, for instance. So in particular, where we need to be mindful of the difference between how Hispanic Catholics and Protestants behave. We also need to look at differences in perceptions of discrimination. There's an interesting paper that was published in the Du Bois Review that looks at Hispanic perceptions of racism and support for Donald Trump. So Hispanics that didn't perceive a lot of societal discrimination were more inclined to support Donald Trump than those who did. And so in this data set, the fact that there were so many Latino Protestants who viewed George Taylor's death as an isolated incident is telling. I also did not ignore the racial and gender gap in terms of support for a Black woman running for vice president. And so Robbie didn't talk about this a whole lot, but they ran another experiment where they asked whether or not it was a good idea for Joe Biden to name a woman or a Black woman as his running mate. And the place where there was the biggest gap was among African-American men who were less likely to support the idea of naming a Black woman relative to a woman in general. I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. I do want to get back to this notion of sort of perception of discrimination, whether or not George Floyd's death was an isolated incident, because I think it speaks to larger issues of systemic racism that will pose challenges for reconciliation and actually for policy in the years to come. So I'm using this particular question as a proxy for respondent perceptions of systemic racism. And so we see increasing convergence among Democrats that police shootings are not isolated incidents. And we also see that Republicans are largely resistant to this idea, and other proxy measures like minorities are likely to be discriminated against, and years of discrimination and slavery explain Black-white inequality. I would argue that if these patterns persist, they will still continue to be the basis of our talking past each other and of us not actually promoting meaningful racial reconciliation in the United States. Another concern for me is the racial differences in issue ranking. So 4.5 months after George Floyd's death, race ranks amongst the top 3 salient issues for African Americans only in the sample. So sympathy is great, and I do want to acknowledge the changes and the recognition of what's going on, but salience actually matters for agenda setting, and this is something that we should be aware of as well. The other data points that stood out to me was among white evangelical behavior, and I'm going to just put my sort of identities out there. This matters to me personally as an evangelical of color. So I have to say nothing surprised me in PRRI's findings. In terms of the perceptual chasm between white evangelicals and Black Protestants. However, these do matter to me from a normative standpoint. The most concerning to me was the fact of the more than half of white evangelicals who said that, who supported Trump, who said that Trump could never lose their support, and the increase in the strategic relativism when it comes to issues related to character. I mean, so in particular, one of the data points shows increasing numbers of white evangelicals who say that they're actually willing to consider political candidates who have exhibited moral failings. And so that number went up from 30% at the beginning of the American Values Survey in the early 2010s, up to 72% last year to 68%, or to 68% today. So this Trump's moral behavior, sort of is implicated in this. And so this gives me a normative concern about a loss of moral authority for evangelicals because of the perceived hypocrisy of the change in attitudes. And also because there are institutional and behavioral concerns that are connected to this and that may be driving what's going on here. So one, I still have to do more study on this, but my hypothesis is that this is being driven by hyperpartisanship and other biases. And I worry about the long-term implications for electoral capture amongst white evangelicals and the potential for benign neglect from the Republican Party or whatever potentially replaces it. And I think that this ties into Robbie's other work, particularly The End of White Christian America, that notes that white evangelicals will shrink as a share of the electorate. And so what does it mean if you have a party that sort of is capturing without question, without critique, the hearts and the minds of one segment of the population? And some people argue, and as a scholar of African-American politics, I'm certainly aware of the sort of notion of a democratic electoral capture and the perceptions of that, within African-American communities. But what I see here is sort of this uncritical acceptance of Trumpian Republican Party orthodoxy that I don't even see in African-American communities. If you look at a lot of the public discourse about younger Blacks being somewhat jaundiced of Joe Biden, of demanding more. If we think about that infamous interchange between Charlemagne the God and Joe Biden in May before George Floyd's death, all of that was actually resisting the notion of capture and demanding policy attention. I'm not seeing that in this data amongst white evangelicals. And so even though it looks like white evangelicals have gotten more out of their relationship with Donald Trump than Blacks have historically gotten out of the Democratic Party, I do wonder whether or not they are heading down an inevitable path of capture that could be really problematic in years to come. So I'll end there, and I look forward to Carlin's comments and the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, and thank you, Robbie, for a wonderful presentation. This is an enormously rich survey. When I get back to my office, I think I will reread a little essay that I have pasted on my office wall. It's written by the great sociologist and pollster Dan Yankelovich. And Dan talked about how Americans make up their minds about issues. And he argued that people, that journalists and social scientists, probably a lot of people listening to this virtual conversation, make up their minds by the accumulation of factual information. And Dan responded that that's not really the way that publics make up their minds. that facts are not unimportant, but they're not the royal road to judgment. And what Dan said was that Americans always start with their values. And that's why I think this particular survey, the 11th edition of this survey, is just enormously important. Like Andra, I'm going to concentrate on a few things that Robbie didn't mention. And one of them is just something I've been working on personally for a few months last summer. I spent a few months looking at every question that's ever been asked on the Electoral College. Gallup asked the very first question in 1944, and they asked a very similar question to the question that Robbie included in this survey in 1948 for the first time. They asked Americans whether the president should be elected, the presidential election should be decided in terms of the popular vote. And in 1948, 63% of Americans said, yes, in fact, that should be the case. In the new survey, it's 66%, virtually identical. And in looking at dozens of questions that have been asked on that subject since 1948, in almost all of them, I think there were only 2 exceptions when people came down on this side of the question. And that's important because it's solid, it's stable overall. But what we also know about the question and the issue is it seems to have very little intensity. And still in polls that ask the question about how we can work to improve our democracy, things such as term limits still have greater salience overall. Robbie touched on one of the questions in the survey on election legitimacy. I'd like to look at another one in the survey, and that is a question that the Pew Research Center has asked after every presidential election since 2004. And they ask Americans whether or not their own vote was counted accurately. They didn't ask about fairness, they simply asked about whether the vote was counted accurately. And in every one of those presidential election years and off-year elections, the vast majority of Americans said that their vote was counted accurately. Robbie asked that question in this survey and found once again 82%. And what was significant that 81% of Republicans and 86% of Democrats believed that their vote would be counted accurately overall. And I think that speaks to most people's personal experience. Robbie has done a lot of work on voting impediments, particularly in the 2018 survey, where he asked people questions about whether or not they had said that they were told when they voted that they had the wrong registration. And he also asked one that has an echo in this survey. He asked whether or not Americans are worried that voters will be harassed. And in fact, 69% of people in this survey said that they were worried that that might happen in this election campaign. But if you go back to the 2018 questions, not only in the PRRI questions, but also in a series of questions asked by Marist and the NPR and the NewsHour, only 1% of Americans indicated that that had ever happened to them. And 89% in the PRRI survey said that that had never happened to anyone in their family or to them. So I think when we ask people about their personal experience of voting impediments, as PRRI has done, you see that those numbers are in the very low single digits. And even when you ask Hispanics and African Americans those identical questions, like the 2018 survey did, again, those numbers were very low overall. This survey, and I think others like it, have pointed to the fact that most people think that we will know the winner in a day or two after the election, whether we're resigned to it or whether we feel that way. But I, again, thought that that was a slightly optimistic note. That was a solid majority in this survey, including 60% of Republicans and 57% of Democrats. I thought the battery on issue emphasis was very interested in issues that were of critical importance to Americans, with coronavirus and the economy very close to the top overall. Regarding coronavirus, Robbie's numbers are absolutely consistent with virtually every other poll I've seen. Only about 33 to 35% approve of the way that Donald Trump has handled the issue overall. One thing, though, that I thought was particularly interesting in this survey is twice as many people trusted Biden a lot to provide accurate information about coronavirus, but only 28% trusted Biden a lot and 14% trusted Trump a lot. Now, again, that's that category in the survey overall. And speaking about healthcare generally, I thought another interesting finding in this survey was that 48% of Democrats strongly favored Medicare for all and 39% somewhat favored it. And again, that's something that could come up after the election if Mr. Biden is the winner. I tend to focus in these sessions, and I have in the past, on the question of abortion, and I have no disagreement with the way that Robbie presented those results. I tend to look at the extremes on that question, and in this survey, 22% thought it should be legal in all circumstances. That number seems to be inching up ever so slightly in a number of surveys that ask the identical question, whereas 13% said it should be illegal in all circumstances. But what I thought was significant in looking at that battery of critical issues, that a third said that abortion would be a critical issue for them, but more Republicans, 41%, than Democrats, said it would be a critical issue for them in the campaign. And I think that is part of the explanation that we saw so much concentration in the Supreme Court hearings last week on the Affordable Care Act and not on the issue of abortion. There was another question in the survey that I think supported that point. 32% of Republicans said they would only support a candidate who shared their views on abortion, compared to 17% of Democrats. The numbers were slightly reversed on the critical issue being the Supreme Court, where more Democrats said that that was going to be a critical issue for them, 53% compared to 44% of Republicans. Interestingly, more Democrats and Republicans strongly favored setting a retirement age for justices in the survey than another question about the Supreme Court appointments. And Robbie talked a lot about the divisions, and I'd like to end on one note that I thought was really very interesting. And this is, I think, the first question in the September part of the survey, and that was whether or not Americans see better days ahead. We've talked about a lot of problems in the society, but 61% of Republicans and 62% of Democrats say that they see better days ahead for Americans, and that's where I'll end. So thank you.
All right, we now turn to the panel discussion. Like Carlin, I'm going to pick up where she left off. Like Carlin, I was astonished by that optimism about the future number. And I'm not sure what to make of it. I'm just going to let that lie there because I want to shift the focus just a little bit. This is, as the title suggests, not just the American Politics Survey, but the American Values Survey. And so I want to shift to a question that's really at the heart of American values, and that is the role of religion and religious belief in public life. And in that connection, I'd like to ask anyone on the panel who's interested to comment on findings from two questions in the survey that I regard as very interesting. Question number one, is it necessary to believe in God in order to be a moral person and lead a moral life? Just 4 years ago, the country was evenly split on that question. 49 say yes, 50% say no. Well, today, the share of Americans who say that it's necessary to believe in God to be moral has declined by 10 full percentage points to just 39%. That is a big shift on a fundamental question in a short period of time. Another example, having to do with American exceptionalism in the world, God has granted the US a special role in history. Just 4 years ago, 57% of Americans answered that question in the affirmative. According to this survey, that's down to 40% today, a 17 percentage point drop. So, panel, would you care to comment on and offer an interpretation of these very large swings in a short period of time on very fundamental questions?
Well, perhaps the coronavirus is the explanation for the second question. If you thought God granted America a special place, you might have thought we would have been spared in some particular way. Didn't happen. So perhaps that explains that very steep drop that you mentioned on that question overall. And I think the growth of the NONES, the nuns that Robbie's talked about so much in these surveys in the past, the growth of those people with no religious views is just sort of sprinting ahead. And I think that's changing views perhaps on the other question.
I agree with Carlin on the last point. My first hypothesis would be to look at the nuns. and to look just at increasing religious diversity, sort of as evidence of the fact that people might be a little bit more sort of resistant to that Judeo-Christian kind of Puritan idea of the city on a hill. You know, and I think the other question would be, and this is, I'm saying this without having modeled it, so this is another hypothesis to throw out. You know, this is the question that I think about with respect to moral authority. And so if you've seen people who think that they are the arbiters of morality compromise heavily in order to achieve short-term political goals, right, that undermines the idea about whether or not you actually need to affirm a belief in God in order to do that, because I think they've seen people profess faith who have behaved in some ways that is quizzical or immoral, and that might be contributing to it.
So I'll jump in on this too. Well, it's notable on the question about you need to believe in God in order to be moral, that the biggest shifts on that question, that's actually been a partisan shift, that it is like a majority of Republicans are still there. They were 54% in 2016. They're 53% agreeing it's necessary to believe in God to be moral. But among Democrats, it is down from 48% to 36%. Among Democrats. It's also down among independents from 43 to 32. So it's really kind of Democrats leading, independents following, Republicans staying the same. So it's this kind of asymmetric polarization phenomenon that we see on a lot of issues, actually, with kind of Republicans staying here and Democrats and independents moving together kind of to a different place. But I think under your interpretation of, I think the division in the country, and I think for many, there's been no question that I have in my entire career answered more times than why do white evangelicals support Donald Trump, who seems to not fit their values, right? I have answered that question probably 200 times in the last 4 years. And so I think it's out there as this kind of named hypocrisy, right? For a group that called itself values voters, and emphasize the character of a candidate when Bill Clinton was in the crosshairs, but hasn't been willing to consistently emphasize character with Donald Trump in the crosshairs. And just so everybody didn't miss it, that Andra highlighted that, I'd still think also one of the more remarkable shifts that is really a sea change in political ethics is really what it shows, is that on this question of whether a candidate can commit an immoral act in their personal life and still behave ethically and fulfill their duties in their public life, there's been an absolute sea change among white evangelicals on that question. Again, in 2011, 32% said that this was possible. It went up to 72% in 2016. It's basically right there, 68% in the current survey. So from 3 in 10 to 7 in 10 is an absolute sea change in the way one evaluates a candidate, right? So less along lines of character, values, and principles, and more on the lines of kind of an ends and means. So Donald Trump is a means to an end. Right. And I think that is really notable as a real sea change in American politics.
I want to come in, if I could, with a series of questions, including some great questions we are getting from the audience. Again, hashtag AVS 2020 on Twitter or events@brookings.edu. Just on the optimism point that Carlin and Bill made, what went through my head was a song called "Things Can Only Get Better." Some people out there may remember that song, and I just think that's a comment on where we are now. But we can, Robbie, you can talk about that. Let me just throw out several things that different people might comment on. One, it was notable that on your issues chart, the issue of immigration wasn't even there because it was so far down the list. Which I have a suspicion helps account for some of the difficulties President Trump is having. That was a signature issue for him in 2016. There are all kinds of reasons why it's not an issue, including the fact that a lot of borders are closed right now. But I just think that's very important. Anybody who wants to comment on that. A couple of questioners asked this. This is a methodological thing I just want to put on the table. You don't have to spend a lot of time on it, Robbie. Why not more data for independents shown here? Just if you could satisfy that concern. This is my question. I was really struck by your findings about the Democratic Party, where, and they were interesting because on the one hand, about half the party supported Joe Biden or one of the other moderate or center-left candidates. And about half the respondents, Democrats, said they supported either Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. But these voters, the Warren Sanders voters, not only are overwhelmingly supporting Biden, but only about half of them, or a quarter of all Democrats, think Biden is too conservative. If I'm remembering right, I tried to check it. I think there's so much interest in your site, Robbie, right now that I couldn't get into your site to double check the number. But it struck me that that might suggest an interesting divide in the Democratic Party, not half and half, but half, a quarter, and a quarter. Half very, very progressive, a quarter very, very progressive, half on the more center, the left side, and then some significant group between those polls. I'd like to toss that out. Lastly, a questioner called Michael asked, does concern about environmental issues represent a rupture between older and younger conservative Christians? I'm curious if you have any indicators of that in a survey. I think it's an interesting question for the long haul. So I throw all those out for anybody to jump on any piece of them if they're interested. Maybe I'll start with Robbie because some of them are very specific to the methods and the survey.
Yeah, I'll take just a couple. I'll take the immigration one. It is notable that it doesn't show up right on the top of the priority list. It also, for those who watch the conventions, it also didn't show up. If you had kind of had a tally sheet of the 2016 Republican convention and the 2020 Republican convention and kind of notched, every time immigration came up, I mean, it would look dramatically different. And so I think we're just seeing the president not talk about, this as much. And what we're seeing is actually a drop in particularly on it's really only on the Republican side of those who are saying it's a critical issue. And typically what we see in our surveys are that those who rank it as a critical issue are more anti-immigration than pro-immigration. So people who want to have more restrictive tend to rate it higher. And so what we've seen is that drop in Republican has dropped. Actually, it was 60% said it was a critical issue in 2016. It's down to 38% in the current survey. So a 22-point drop in its importance over the last 4 years. Among Democrats, there's no change. It's 37% in 2016, 37% in 2016, and 36% in 2020. So no movement on its importance among Democrats, but this just real cliff drop off among Republicans. We also are seeing a little bit of softening just on the about not on policy. Policy hasn't moved, but on immigrants themselves, like about kind of more positive views of immigrants themselves. That's inched up a little bit among Republicans as well. And on the question real quickly on the data about independence, often on these charts. So we certainly have that for anyone out there, who wants it. It's there, and in the full report, we do break out independents. You're always making choices in the PowerPoint about whether to put all Americans or independents, and usually don't put both because they tend to just lay right on top of each other in charts and be a little more mangling and confusing. So made a decision to put all Americans, and in almost every chart, the independents are right on top of where all Americans are. The one other thing I'll say too, just to wrap this up on immigration, is that there is one issue that EJ and Bill, you may remember, we've been asking since 2012 about whether immigrants who are living in the country illegally should be allowed a way to become citizens, provided they meet certain requirements. And despite the political football that immigration has been and policies that have been up for consideration and not, and anti-immigrant rhetoric from the president, that issue has hardly moved in any survey that we have fielded since 2012. It is today, again, a little bit more than 6 in 10 Americans. It is super majorities of Democrats, solid majorities of independents, and about half of Republicans who agree that that when you ask what to do about immigrants who are living in the country illegally, say that they support a path to citizenship. So I kind of still put that on the, wow, despite all the disagreement, that still hasn't moved across all, 2 administrations, all kinds of rhetoric. That's still there and still solid.
Before I turn to Andra and Carlin, can I just ask you for 15 seconds, since I couldn't check them, was my characterization of your numbers on the Democratic side correct? And do you have just 10 seconds on that?
Yes, it is mostly correct. It's also worth noting that only 3 in 10 Democrats say that they had originally hoped Biden would be the Democratic nominee. So that's worth noting. And so there has been a kind of coalescing around it. And your kind of characterization of it being about half and half, I think is about right. And then when we ask about whether he's too conservative, it is true that liberal Democrats, about a quarter of liberal Democrats say he's too conservative. And that they preferred, a more progressive candidate. But when we ask about their support, there's really no drop off, in support. But there is about a quarter of liberal Democrats who see Biden as too conservative.
Yeah, I guess I was surprised that was quite low.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't shocking because of the coalescing around Biden, and he is the nominee, but that's still only a quarter of liberals saying that. I found interesting. Anyone else have anything to say about any of these questions? So just to throw one more, since we have Andra and Carlin are warmly consensual in their hopes for the country and the way you spoke. Janet wanted to know what values we agree on, and Tamara asked if anybody's interested in compromise. So did either of you have a response to any of this package of issues I put on the table? Then I'll go back to Bill. Andra, do you want to go?
So, I'm not sure that this survey captures, and Robbie, please correct me if I'm wrong, sort of places where we could sort of find common ground. I mean, one of the things from a policy standpoint that I don't think we've gotten a whole lot of discussion. We just talked about sort of the majorities of folks, regardless of partisan affiliation, who support Dreamers, for instance, or Path to Citizenship. But also if we look at other types of policy proposals, like, trying to make college free for people, or even Medicare for all, right? Like there is this consensus around these issues that does not actually get reflected in policy debates. So if that's going to get refracted through a hyper-partisan legislative lens, I'm not sure where we're going to get. This is sort of almost like the gun control issue, where majorities of Americans do believe in common sense gun control. It's just that the people who are in charge of making the decisions don't believe in that, and they're at loggerheads with each other. So, on the one hand, and we don't ask the question in this particular survey about, do you hate Congress but love your member, your own personal member, even though there are questions about who you're going to vote for in Congress, right? If people recognize that Congress as an institution is a problem, but yet each individual district keeps on electing the same people, this is probably going to, continue to exacerbate these particular problems. And we aren't getting into questions here and couldn't, and it's a much more complicated issue than sort of saying, oh, well, this is all about gerrymandering, because I don't actually agree with that. I think that, I think that this is really complex. And I think one of the things that kind of comes from this is a need for people to listen to each other more. And my fear is that the people's fundamental priors are sort of hardwired by partisanship, or by other biases, or by a refusal to see the world from the perspective of people who live and walk in different bodies, that it might actually be harder for us to be able to see that. I pray that we get there. I mean, one of the things that sort of came out is the difference among whites based on college education. And so while there's this huge still inequality between people of color and whites who are given the opportunity to go to college, I'm like, wow, I need more white people to go to college, right? So different people and different ideas.
Carlin.
Well, I'll just pick up where Andra left off. I agree that every time you ask a question about should we compromise on XYZ, Americans for the most part are in favor of compromise, or at least they pay lip service to it. But the partisanship is so hardwired on so many of these questions that you just tend to take your partisan opinions or take your partisan positions on these kinds of questions. I think you're both right on immigration, Robbie and EJ, that the borders are closed and Trump's not talking about it, and you have those numbers are going down. But we've seen something really unusual in the polls this year, is that support for, Gallup's asked this question since I think the 40s about increasing, decreasing, or keeping immigration levels about the same. And you've seen the positive side of those numbers go up to levels we've never seen before. And I think often publics act as a counterweight to whoever's in power. And so that may be one of the reasons you're seeing people push in this direction, but it's just generally more positive views about immigrants and also about immigration.
Bill.
Yep. Well, let me just comment briefly on what Robbie and Carlin said about immigration. one of the things that maddens Americans the most about American politics is how long it takes their elected representatives to catch up to a consensus that has existed among Americans for a very long time, right? I mean, we're talking now about the better part of 2 decades where Americans have agreed on the basic outlines of immigration reform, and yet the political system has failed to get it done. And I think politically we have paid a big price for that. So that's the only editorial comment I'm going to offer. Now, here's my question. You know, going back to religion and values. You know, I am plenty old enough to remember a group spearheaded by white evangelical Protestants that called itself the moral majority. I don't think it could call itself the moral majority with a straight face anymore. As I read this survey, and a number of questions from the audience pointed in this direction, white evangelical Protestants now appear to me to be increasingly isolated outliers in the American population. And so my question is, first of all, is that reading of the survey correct? And secondly, if it is, what are the long-term consequences for American politics and society?
I'll jump in first. I mean, it's a great big picture question. I think it's right that we see increasingly white evangelicals kind of out on an island in the religious landscape by themselves and drifting. If we can think about tectonic plates moving kind of islands around in the ocean, I mean, their tectonic plate is drifting further and further from the mainland here. And so both the terms moral and the term majority, I think, would be challenged. You know, in today's climate, as they've embraced, and we talked about a kind of more utilitarian kind of real politic, you know, kind of embracing someone who didn't fit their values. And then I think also the majority part. It was worth noting that white evangelical Protestants today make up 15% of the U.S. population. You know, so they've been a shrinking and aging population. Their median age keeps creeping up as the numbers are going down. So I think that's really notable. And so they're losing members both from attrition, from younger people leaving, and from just older people dying. And so even in states like Texas, right, white evangelicals are only 17% of Texans. And some of these other states that we now have in the toss-up category, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and the Sun Belt, are affected by this kind of changing demographics in the country. And I think the other thing that elected officials haven't caught up with is that there was the sense that white evangelicals were speaking for all Christians, period, or all white Christians for sure. And I think one of the reasons why I spent as much time as I did trying to put some daylight there is that it really is true. They are unique in so many ways. I mean, they're the only religious group that has a strong majority opposing same-sex marriage today, for example, right? They're just kind of out on it. And that wasn't true 10 years ago. And they really were kind of in the majority on that question. But I think legalization of marijuana is one we haven't talked about, but the country's really moved on that question as well, quite dramatically, 68% supporting that today, right at the same number of supporting same-sex marriage. But I think that elected officials and policymakers haven't also quite caught up with that the particular positions staked out by white evangelicals represent an increasingly shrinking and graying proportion of the population, and certainly don't speak for Christians of color. I mean, that chart of like white evangelicals up here and black evangelicals way down, you know, black Protestants way down here. I mean, that's dramatic. I mean, we've got to remember those divisions. And even among Catholics, the division between white Catholics and Latino Catholics on many political issues is yawning.
Let me add a couple of things there. I mean, I think part of what Robbie is pointing out is manifesting itself in terms of perceptions of loss of social dominance, right? And so the whole 10-point scale isn't included in the survey, but the idea that white evangelicals perceive that Christians that are being discriminated against in particular, right, certainly has a politics of grievance kind of undertone to it. And I think that does reflect a certain type of backlash politics. However, on the other side, The way you frame the question, Bill, if you were to take that into a white evangelical church, based on what I've even heard in the last couple of weeks on online church, I think there are people who would question you, right? I think there are people who really still do believe that non-evangelical groups on certain values issues. And then there is the chasm between white evangelicals and evangelicals of color. And part of that sort of represents power differentials, kind of like within the church, and who gets to speak for the church, and what that looks like. And I think that those battles are still to be fought. And so there was a question that kind of showed up in the chat that wanted to try to explain what's going on. Since I haven't run models on this data, I'm just going to speak to other data that I have where I have run models, and some of it is state specific, but I think it points in a larger national direction. You know, if you're looking at whites, and I put all whites in a model and say I did this in Alabama in 2017, and I'm trying to predict support for Roy Moore, even with a large sort of evangelical segment in there, my biggest coefficient is going to be party. And there always is this endogeneity problem that we have to deal with, but this is party. So in the same way that Black Protestants are being defined by their racial interests because they are in fact existential, white evangelicals are being defined by their party identification. And so it is party that is driving these compromises. And I think the larger question is that evangelicals are supposed to be driven by something else. And so why isn't that happening here? Like, why is it that it seems like you care more about the things of this world and then the things, you know, that are otherworldly or heavenly in this particular instance? And so I think that those are really important soul searching questions that, you know, are going to have to be answered at some point. I don't know if it's going to get answered this cycle, but perhaps that sort of demographic reckoning is going to eventually happen where there's going to have to be some reflection.
Carlin?
I don't really have anything. I just wondered a question for Robbie, whether he expects these people, I think is it the Rod Dreher book on the Benedict adoption, where they simply would remove themselves. I mean, under suggested they're very political, and I think they are, but I'm just wondering if at some point when your numbers get so much smaller, you just not only isolate, you remove yourself from society as a whole. I'm curious about Robbie's thoughts on that.
Yeah, I doubt it. I think that'll be an option for some, maybe younger, tribe that might wants to kind of opt out, but I don't see that. I mean, white evangelicals have spent the better part of half a century building a power structure, and it's been a political power structure and a cultural power structure, and walking away from that, I just can't see it. I think we are seeing, I think some, I'll point to like one thing that I think is important on the racial justice issue. When the president in the debate refused to kind of denounce the Proud Boys, white supremacists, stand back and stand by, the next morning, the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, J.D. Greer, and the executive committee came on Twitter and said, let's be clear, none of us should refuse to denounce white supremacists. Now, that's, quite something, I think, for them to kind of come in right the next morning and just say, let's put a stake down that this is something that we, even though we know that 8 in 10 of our constituents are going to vote for this president, like still, I think the leadership putting that stake down is important. So we're seeing some of that happen. But as far as like, I think any grand, retraction from society, I can't see that happening.
Okay, EJ, we have about 7 or 8 minutes left. Let's see if we can organize it so I'll have time at the end to slip in a gender question, which we haven't touched on yet.
Well, you know what I could do? Why don't we, I just have a couple of things I want to put on the table, partly from our smart viewers today. And then why don't you put the gender question on, and then we can let everybody kick it around. Would that work?
That would work perfectly.
Yep. Okay, well, there's one question here I just want to read verbatim because I love the way Greg, as it happens, wrote it. He wrote, is there anything, all caps, in the poll where Fox viewers align with the mainstream or parentheses gulp, parentheses, even Democrats? I asked Greg's question because I would love you, Robbie, to talk a little more about Fox News Republicans and other Republicans and what that may tell us about what might happen inside the Republican Party if President Trump loses in the fall. What do we get out of that? Secondly, I just want to go back to that environment and age question that was asked earlier, because I do think that, you know, and really talk a bit about generational issues, because generation looms at so many moments in this survey, on attitudes toward religion, on attitudes toward the presidential. If you could talk a bit about that, and then I'll go to Bill to ask his gender question.
Okay, well, my gender question comes in two parts, one specific, the other general. First of all, Andra, I cannot resist the opportunity to ask you to expand on that astonishing finding about Black men and their attitudes towards a Black woman vice presidential nomination. I fell off my chair laughing when I saw that one. I'm not sure whether laughter is the right response, but that was my response. And then the more general form of the question: 50% of men, 50, say that American society is punishing men just for being men. How are we to understand that?
I think I'll answer the second question first, and then get back to the first question. I mean, there's a partisan shift in that. So Democratic men seem to, I mean, this is basically trying to sort of signal sort of attitudes about Me Too. And it seems like Democratic men are on board with sort of ideas about gender equity, about addressing sort of like these issues. And Republicans want to sort of maintain the same boys will be boys attitude. Like, we don't have applied questions about sort of like, you know, what do you do in a Harvey Weinstein situation, or, you know, what do we do, you know, about pay? But like, you know, that seems to be kind of like, you know, what's going on there is that, again, partisanship is so hardwired that it infects like literally everything that you think about certain issues. Now, to get to the question about this experiment, which I'm really glad that you did, Robbie. You know, and I'm going to be using this in my class just because it's a really good example sort of how question wording matters, right? The only thing that's different between these two questions is the insertion of the word Black. There's another survey experiment that also does the same thing about protests, where you do see these huge chasms where people are in general fine with protests, but as soon as you add Black people to it, then all of a sudden the question goes down. And so Robbie talked about that earlier, but here where we see the question, we see these differences and less support for the idea of Joe Biden naming a Black woman compared to a woman in general. And the demographic that seems to be the most resistant to this idea of a Black woman were African-American men. And so the question that we have here without testing is whether or not this is sexism or whether or not people think that this is strategic, right? And so we've seen places in sort of history where African-American voters have been resistant to African-American candidates if they thought that they weren't particularly viable. So in particular, older Blacks in 1984 during the primaries didn't support Jesse Jackson because they didn't see a path to victory for him. They changed their mind in 88 for other reasons, but like it was that first strategic kind of impulse that kind of kept them away. It really didn't have anything to do with Jackson as a person per se, but it was just the idea that America wasn't ready for a Black president. And so if these Black men are paternalistic and they think that America isn't ready for a Black female vice president, right, then that might sort of hold them back. And it might not be their sexism, but I don't want to rule out sexism as a possible explanation, but I would need more questions and modeling in order to be able to definitively answer this question. You know, I think some people are shocked to recognize that there are actually race gender gaps as well. So we talk about the overall gender gap. And I think we thought that it was largely driven by whites, but the truth is for the last couple of election cycles, we have seen robust gender gaps amongst Black populations and amongst Latinx populations as well. So, you know, I can't say that I was terribly surprised by what I saw, but again, it's just really, as a Black woman, I was kind of somewhat disappointed in Black men.
If I could just put in a plug for another Brookings scholar this morning, Bill Fry in the Metropolitan section of Brookings presented at the States of Change meeting on generations, and just see, these are simulations looking out to many, many elections in the future and how various generations were going to perform. And they look pretty democratic going forward, given the change in the racial and ethnic makeup of the population. I think, though, I may be wrong, that younger African-American men were none too happy with Hillary Clinton too, if I remember that. So it isn't just something that we're seeing in this election. It's something that's been there and I think needs further examination. The question about Fox viewers and is there anything they agree with? I mean, you could turn that around and ask yourself whether MSNBC viewers would agree with Republicans on anything. And I think the answer would probably be fairly similar.
Yeah, the only catch there, as you know, Carlin, is that the Fox hold that the Fox has on Republicans is much greater, as you saw in the survey, that Democrats tend to have a much more diverse set of media choices when you ask about it. There's something, Fox has a power, I think, in our politics that no other network does. Do you disagree with that?
I would agree that Fox has a greater power than MSNBC, but if you put those MSNBC together with CNN and a few other things, I think you'd probably see something similar. But again, it's just idle speculation.
That's it. You could run that, Robbie. You should.
I can run it.
Do you want to close, Robbie?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'll pick up on this Fox News thing. And, you know, I do think, again, it's 40% of Republicans, right, who say that they most trust Fox News. So it's a minority, but a big minority of Republicans. They do look on almost every question. To pick up that one question, is there anywhere they look the same? It is on that question that Bill cited, that America's best days are ahead of us. There they look like Democrats and like other Republicans. It's about 6 and 10 who say America's best days are but I think, EJ, you may be right that it is that, well, when you're down in the mud or down in the gutter, everything looks better from where you're at, and different interpretations of what gutter we're in, right, across different sides of the aisle. But I do think the real question for us in the future is, what does that party look like if Trump is not the president, right? And whether that Fox News Republican group is Trumpism without Trump, right? And that will continue in some form. And you know, I mean, I've always thought that really what Trump has done is sort of coalesce these things that were already there in many ways, that Fox had been organizing in some ways these viewers long before Trump walked onto the stage. But he was very gifted, I think, at activating them and coalescing them in a way that no other candidate had done. And so the real question is, I think, with Trump off the stage, you know, if he comes off the stage either in 4 weeks or 4 years, you know, what that looks like inside the Republican Party, whether that diffuses or whether that holds on, right? Because right now what you essentially have is a party within the party, right? That is kind of organized around its allegiance to Fox News, and particularly to this president.
Yeah, just to Carlin's point, I was raising that not to make a comment on Fox. I could, but that's not what I was trying to do. It was more to identify that you do have these very distinct pieces of the Republican Party that are kind of neatly identified by that one variable that could be instructive going forward. But I just want to thank everyone, and I'm going to let my distinguished colleague close for us. This was fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Bill?
Well, I really don't feel the need to add anything to those two closing sentiments, EJ, with which I heartily concur. Let me especially thank our two wonderful panelists for organizing such great commentaries and answers to questions on rather short notice, and to our very large audience for your questions and for your patience. We're about 2 minutes over. I'd love to continue this. I have another 100 questions on my notepad, but there is no time. So I believe that we are adjourned.
Thank you all. Thanks, Robbie.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.